Hi, welcome to the board. I'm Kirsten Donaldson, Agile Coach at Boost New Media.
Hi, my name is Paul Plewanning. I'm also an Agile Coach here at Boost.
Gavin Coughlin, the third Agile Coach here at Boost.
So what are we talking about today, guys?
We're here to talk about flow.
Flow. Interesting.
Yeah. So we're talking about flow in sprints and just discussing flow in general. So this came up for me a few days ago when we were just talking in our one of our retrospectives about increasing the flow of stories through the sprint. So this is why I wanted to talk about this today. I started revisiting a lot of reasons why we do these things and why flow is important within the sprint.
What were you finding was an issue? I mean, what was holding up your flow and disrupting your rhythm?
In this instance, it was a large story that had it grown in size. Mm-hmm. There was a certain amount of the product owner just wanted to get the work done. It was really important work, and they really couldn't see a way of breaking the story down to get the value they wanted. And as the story grew, they just kept pushing the story to be completed, so it just rolled from sprint to sprint. And so I think it ended up taking around 3 sprints to close. It grew from a size 5 to an 8, then to a 13.
What effect did that have on the team?
They were tired. They were over it by the time they closed that story.
Yeah.
Even though they had a remarkably good sprint and their velocity was really high, they were sitting in the retrospective looking and saying, I did the De Bono six hats retrospective with them, and the first one of the first hats is the emotion red hat. I think it's emotion, and tired, low, all those kind of down kind of emotions were coming out. They were also happy that they finally closed that story, so there was elements of that as well. But
still, in a 3 sprint situation, that means it takes 6 weeks for them to be happy that they closed that story, which is obviously less than ideal.
Yeah.
Long time to wait to be happy.
That's right.
Yeah,
and it took 6 weeks for the product owner to get any value from that story at all.
Yeah.
So,
do you think that this story could have been broken down? Was it possible to have broken this story down?
I think there are, because there's definitely strategies for breaking stories down, and I don't think there was a reluctance to try any of those strategies. So that's something that the team have taken on board now, and they're because they will at the next product backlog grooming session. There's a flow chart that we're going to put up later. We're going to talk about later that talks about how we break down stories using various approaches. Yeah. Either by functionality or by business, or maybe by process and so on. But the team want to enforce the use of that flow diagram.
Okay.
I was looking at that online yesterday. Actually, it looks really helpful because it's quite specific, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it really does sort of give you 2 paths off each flow. I think we're going to put up a link to that shortly.
Yeah, we will.
And just before we get into that, actually, what advantages do you think there will have been from breaking that story down?
Well, this is where I went back and looked at the roots of why we do these things in Scrum in particular, and so then I started looking at Kanban, and because Kanban's only got 3 basic underpinnings, which are visualize your work, so have a visual workspace, limit the work in progress, and reduce the size of your unit of work. And so obviously limiting the work in progress and reducing the size of the unit of work all increase the flow of stories or whatever you're using in your Kanban process as your work unit, as they pass through the process. And so I was looking at that, and I sent you guys a link yesterday, which was a really interesting. I found it really interesting. It took me back to the roots of Kanban, which was One Day in Kanban Land. It was called, which is just a comic strip showing you just the simple principles of Kanban, and the fact that when somebody gets stuck at one part in the process, then quite naturally you get a bit of a logjam, if you like, because you've limited the work in progress, and so they only had 2 items in their work in progress column, and as soon as that happened, it meant that people didn't have anything to do earlier on in the process, and they all gathered around the person who was stuck later in to work out what they could do to free up that work, or to remove the delay or the impediment. And so it's that simple. So breaking down the story size has got the advantage of breaking the story down in that instance is that you get the I think it goes back to that game that we played with on the Scrum XP workshop that we went on a while back, where we saw that we were playing the ball game, and we tried to optimize the number of balls in play, and we thought that the optimal number would be one ball per person, and we found it really awkward when we were trying to pass the balls.
It was a bit of a juggling act, wasn't it?
Yeah, because you were throwing a ball at the same time you were catching the ball from another person.
And for those of us that are not that dexterous, it was quite hard.
It was really hard.
Do we want to describe the ball game? Because I've seen this ball game played in a few different courses and workshops, just to demonstrate a few different things. One is how to increase the flow of a team, and the other one is shows how limiting your work in progress helps as well. But also you have little mini retrospectives. So the ball game, you're given a bucket of balls, and you have a group of people, and you have to see how many balls can be passed or thrown to each person. And each ball is only counted when it goes through every single person in that team. And you have your first round, and usually that's not super productive because you're not given any time to plan out how you're actually going to do this. And then you have a little mini retrospective where you talk about how you might change your process to be more productive. And then usually the second time is far more productive than the first. And at some point, because you might do 4 or 5 of these sprints, if you want to call them sprints, where you're throwing this ball backwards and forwards. And at some point, might be the third sprint, you decide to do something radically different than what you've been doing in the past. And that might actually lower your productivity when you first try these things. But if you refine that a little bit, usually it increases productivity a lot by the end of it. So this ball game also shows you how retrospectives help you improve
the process
in between sprints.
Just we've got a pause. Gareth Morgan's just asked us a question. How do you handle stories that explode in scope?
That's a good question.
Yes.
Obviously, if it's in the sprint, then and it explodes in scope, then you have to have a conversation with the product owner about what's going to give. Something's going to give. Either that story is going to get broken down, and you would create separate stories for future sprints, or you would have a discussion around what else in the sprint backlog was less important, and therefore would
be taken out.
Yeah.
So did this happen? Your story that carried on for 3 sprints. Did the scope increase in that as well as it being quite a large story?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was a number of red flags for me with that story, and the team did flag that as an issue in the sprint planning session. Was it that the story had too many unknown acceptance criteria on it? There was no, and it really wasn't, because it was really a spike. It was an exploratory story, because we couldn't afford to do the work up front to work out, to make it unknown.
As such, should that have been a time box story? Do you think? Would that have helped?
Yeah, maybe, but then the product owner,
hindsight, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. We could have done doing some exploratory work, scope the story in the form of so spike it, scope, and then scope future stories with the knowledge that you've gained from the spike is the answer.
But I guess something this is all learning for when this comes up again, though, right?
That's right.
It's a valuable thing to have gone through, even though it's a bit of a drag having to go through 3 sprints with the same story in it.
Yeah,
it's all helpful.
I've had some situations in the past, and this might be for slightly simpler stories than the one that you're talking about, but where there's a story in the sprint and it is exploding in scope a little bit, and people are sort of adding ideas into it as the story is being worked on, and acceptance criteria getting added to it. And I think that's a bit of a red flag and a warning sign as well, and time for the team to say, well, maybe the story is exploding in size, maybe we can just complete the original story, and the original acceptance criteria and all these other things which are being added on as possibly enhancements could be treated as another story and put into the next sprint. So at least that keeps the flow going and keeps the stories getting completed. It's kind
of a delicate balance, though, isn't it? Because we are often talking to our clients while stories are being completed and saying, hey, what about doing this, or they've got suggestions. And quite often we incorporate all that stuff, but it's just judging where that's just becoming too much.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, that's right.
you know, because obviously we're always going to have conversations during the course of the working on the story that aren't included in acceptance criteria necessarily.
Yeah. I think if a story keeps growing in size mid-sprint, you're just falling into old patterns really, where it's really hard to get things done because everybody loses sight of what actually means for that story to be done.
That's right.
And almost any story that you work on can be worked on for a long period of time, but you have to have these parameters in place to...
Yeah.
Is this a good time to talk about the INVEST model, do you think? About how stories should be constructed?
If I had something prepared. Oh, hold on.
Wait.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the INVEST model for writing user stories, and this is just something that can help you know, or when you're writing user stories, something to have in mind, just so you know that that user story is going to be useful and providing as much value as possible. So I've just written out the word INVEST here, and each letter here stands for anything. So we'll just talk about the first one first. Excuse me.
So what is that first one, Gavin? Tell us about
that. The first one
is
independent. So your story should be independent as much as possible. Obviously there's going to be dependencies. It's unavoidable to have it completely independent every single time, but as much as possible to keep that story independent, because part of the joy of user stories is being able to move them around and prioritize them based on a few things, whether it's business value or user value. And if that story is dependent on a whole bunch of other stories, it's going to be very difficult to actually
quantify that.
To have it flexible and be able to move that around and prioritize it
and deliver it. And for example, so I'm trying to think of an example, but when you've got dependencies, you often will make you mitigate those dependencies by creating some kind of pseudo functionality around, so that you can deliver the value that you want to within that story, while ignoring the other dependencies that you've got. It's quite hard though. It takes more time for the development team to build stories that have dependencies. So that's why we go for as independent as possible.
Yeah. Good.
So next one.
I might as well keep this board in my hand.
Yeah.
Next one is
negotiable. I'll just say it while Gav's writing.
Negotiable.
Negotiable.
You don't like the DDE.
Right.
So negotiable. So
this
user stories up until they're put into the sprint backlog are up for negotiation, right?
That's right.
And they're there to create a conversation, so they should always be able to be rewritten and acceptance criteria to be modified or added or taken out. And
so Ron Jeffers, the person who created user stories, said they're the start of a conversation.
Yeah, that's right.
And then he also gave the 3 C's to them, which were card, they're written on a card, conversation, confirmation. What's interesting is, like, I was having a conversation about user stories with another coach, and they were saying, how often do your stories get talked about before they get brought into the sprint backlog? And he was suggesting that I mark the story, if it was a physical card that we had, then mark it with a dot each time we talk about it with the product owner. Because
that's interesting.
It's important that the team does have some negotiation around the story before it gets into the sprint backlog. And if the story suddenly appears during sprint planning, there's very little room for manoeuvre for the team. It's almost forced upon them. So at least one product backlog grooming session where they've seen the story beforehand. Is
that happening on your sprint at the moment?
It is happening, yeah.
So the whole team are in backlog grooming?
They do, they are, yeah.
Okay.
And that's great, because then by the time it comes to actually work on the story, everybody has a really deep understanding of what's to be, what's expected from the story and what value the story is actually providing. Whereas if they're fresh to it at the start of every sprint, there's obviously going to be a lot of time sort of wasted, or a lot of time spent rather on discussions there and then trying to figure out what the story actually means.
The coach was suggesting though that they didn't think that the team just seeing it in product backlog grooming and seeing it in sprint planning was enough time for the team, especially around these rather thorny stories or these trickier stories that need a degree of work.
But how does that balance out against the idea of not looking into solutions for stories before you start working on them, you know?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Because you don't want to spend too much time, you don't want to sort of be looking at the backlog and Piddle Tracker or whatever you use, or Rally,
That's right.
all the time, you know, because that's kind of wasting time and work.
Perhaps that's a good time for the Scrum Master to jump in and say, you know, actually I think we're talking about this in too fine grain, we're talking about the solution now, maybe it's time to take a step back. And
which is fine during those meetings, backlog grooming and sprint planning, but if your coach is saying people should be looking at stories more than that, you know, when would they do that?
Yeah, I guess when they get written, when they're put from that way, you know, when they're put into the product backlog.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting. I'm interested to see how that conversation evolves and what we do to mitigate. Obviously, we were talking about the flow diagram that talks about how to break down stories earlier, and I think that's one way. That's one way of negotiating with the product owner.
Yeah.
And it starts off fairly simply. I don't know if it's a good time to talk about that.
Yeah, go for it.
But it's just basically saying, is the story 1/6 from 1/10 to 1/6 of your velocity? And for this team, their velocity is roughly 30 points. So that's I'm going to do my maths now.
Yeah, don't ask me.
It's between a 3 and a 5. Between a 3 and a 5. Between a 3 and a 5.
That's good maths.
So that's a good size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's not between a 3 and a 5, then use the flow diagram to see what you can do.
Whether it should be broken down.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So
what's the next one, Gav?
Next one is valuable.
Which kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah.
In that it needs to offer value to an end user or
That's
have
right.
business value.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you can't think of any value for the user in your story, you've got a bit of a problem there. And that problem may arise, you know, when you're writing a story, it's as an actor, I want to action to get an achievement. If you can't think of that achievement part of the story, that might mean that your story isn't actually offering the value that you needed to.
Or the story, it needs to have something more to it.
Yeah, possibly.
So it needs to be revised.
exactly. Yeah. No.
Okay.
So,
Well, next one is estimable.
So this is a big red flag for the team when they're looking at a story and their estimates in terms of the story sizing are complete. You know, when they're planning poker, for example, they're all over the show, and that's indicative of a story not being estimable.
Not being estimable, yeah.
And it's usually because there's unknowns for them, whatever the unknowns are. You know, the business, domain knowledge, maybe technology is an issue, maybe something like that. But there's definitely unknowns when they've got wild opinions on the size of a story. So it has to be estimable. And how is it estimable? I would say one way is to talk to the team about the acceptance criteria that have been added to that story, and which of those acceptance criteria they can commit to, and which of them are unknowns for them. You know, for example.
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I don't know if you guys got any other ideas around resolving.
Well, usually, in my experience, I find if something is difficult to estimate, it creates a lot of conversation. And these conversations I feel are very important to have, and somebody who cites it as, for an example, an 8 might have a lot of information or a lot of concerns about a story that somebody who cites it as a 3 might not have thought of. Or obviously the person who has cited it as a 3 might actually know stuff that's already in place. Or might make the story a lot simpler. So I think these conversations usually are enough to sort out these
Resolve
stories.
it,
There are conversations that are absolutely necessary, because that's the whole point of estimating a lot of times, is to create that sort of conversation and give everybody a shared understanding. So I think it's very important for those conversations to be had at that point. I mean, that's in my experience usually enough to get an estimate for that.
That's right. If there's too many unknowns for the team, then they'll spike the story, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So next one is small, and you already mentioned this a little bit, Paul, where you said that a story should be 1/6 or to 1/10.
1/10 to 1/6.
1/10 to 1/6 of their velocity.
That's right. And small is important because there's a number of reasons. Smaller things are more easy, or easier to estimate in terms of their size. And the estimate is almost certainly likely to be so I'll start again. The estimate's going to be more accurate for smaller stories. Estimates get wilder the larger the story and the more the unknowns and the uncertainty around the story.
And I was in a situation recently, it was interesting, we were doing backlog grooming and talking about a few stories which had a lot of similarities. Once you did the first story, the second story would be easier to do because I had a lot of similar functionality. So people were talking about combining these stories, and there were 6 of the stories in total, so they wanted to combine these 6 stories into one.
Wow.
And I thought that was a danger really, because if they, for example, if these 6 stories were all one and they didn't complete all those 6 elements, then that story would not be finished for that sprint. But if they left them separate ones and they didn't finish one element, at least they still have 5 stories finished and one not finished. And also it just helps a lot for the team for getting that flow and for being able to finish these stories and let their stand-up say, okay, I've sent this story off for acceptance.
And I mean, they can actually see progress. I mean, this is the morale thing that we touched on a little bit earlier.
That's right.
The morale sort of suffers if they're not finishing stories within the sprint, and it really sort of drags everyone down, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, correct me if you think this is wrong, but is any story ever too small, really?
It's interesting that we did have a couple of small things come up that were literally just one line changes or whatever, which is a bit awkward. So they bundled them into a one story. Because it wasn't really appropriate to size it as there is a 0 in our deck, which means it means no effort.
Right. I think the problem with if they are that small is you need to go back to the is it valuable?
That's right.
Is it offering value to the user? Because that's when it may not be actually. But then if you bundle them together, maybe then that does offer value as a bunch of stuff. So I guess if you go back to the invest model to sort of see whether it's
absolutely. The last one then is T, which is testable.
So testable is another key element to get the story accepted, essentially, and keep to stop stories dragging on. If you can say that a story is testable, if you can sit down with the product owner at the beginning of before the story is worked on and write acceptance tests with them, then you're the first step to scoping the story, and not having that kind of story balloon and suddenly drag, which is the obviously. I mean, it helps for the developers picking up the story because of the techniques that we use as well. So for test-driven development and behaviour-driven development, you're not going to be able to do that if it's not testable, right? That's right.
That's very true.
And those types of testing are more about design than they are about testing, if you know what I mean. So it's really important to have that conversation with the product owner to make sure that the story is testable, that everyone understands what the acceptance tests are at least.
Because it would actually be pretty hard to design it if it wasn't testable, given the techniques that we use.
Exactly.
I think do we have another question in there?
We do. So Gareth said, "What role does teamwork play in flow?" Which is something we were talking about this morning when we were talking about your big story, weren't we?
That's right. Because what happens with the big stories, and I did an interesting retrospective with the guys, asking them so I did, it's called reverse brainstorming. So you think they wanted to break down their story size, so it would make sure they broke down their stories into smaller sizes before they started working on them. And I asked them the opposite of that. What would it look like if they didn't break down the stories, or if they made the stories larger before they started working on them? And so what happens is you get people trapped or stuck on stories, and they develop very specialist skills because they get stuck in niches. And so that only one person or only 1 or 2 people work on a specific feature, and nobody else has touched it. Nobody else in the team has seen.
Which really takes them back into that silo that people worked in a more traditional project management methods. You've got this specialist sitting in the corner who doesn't really talk to anyone else, and
that's right.
Just does their work, and
he built the order
quite
feature.
Isolated.
Well, so earlier in the week we had we got together with a lot of other Scrum practitioners from around Wellington, and somebody actually brought this exact thing up. And he wanted to keep people in the flow, and what he meant by that is when somebody has a specialty and something that they love doing and something that they're an expert at, when they work on that throughout the day, they get into a flow and they're uber productive. And the one problem that this guy who's a Scrum Master found is that Scrum doesn't always allow people to work on their specialties and do just what they want to do all the time.
Yeah.
And he thought that's can be a bit of an impediment for people getting into that flow, into that sort of uber
which is a different
mode.
kind of flow, though,
Yeah,
isn't it?
that's
To what
right.
we're talking about today. You know, it's that individuals finding their flow and you know, being productive.
That's right. Yeah.
But I was saying to you this morning, Gav, that I think that is. You know, people who are very used to working in that way might find it a problem, but people who are embracing working in an agile way would be more keen to work on stories together and pass work along and have input.
And they'll still get that opportunity to work on their specialty stuff, you know, on occasion. And that's great, but that knowledge needs to be shared around and passed around. And I mean, that whole cross-functionality idea isn't just there to sound pretty, it's really important. And if somebody's, you know, somebody's a specialist in one thing and they go on holiday for 3 weeks, well, what's going to happen? The stories which are based around that functionality is going to fall apart.
And so we talk about T-shaped people, the T-shape, which is so people do have a specialist. They have deep knowledge around something usually, or deep knowledge around several things, but they have a very broad understanding of other aspects of the team and teamwork. So.
And that's something I've heard being talked about quite a lot at the moment, this T-shaped person. That's something that we're trying to create here, and it works really well. So somebody's always going to have a deep knowledge of one particular area. But yeah, it's absolutely important to have that knowledge.
There's a couple of things around cross-functionality in Scrum and cross-functional teams, and one of them is that you've got team members, or you've got the skills within the team to do the job. And then inevitably, what happens is you get this cross-pollination, where you get where the T-shaped people start getting created, because the teamwork that is involved in Scrum and the sort of inherent nature of the Scrum, you know, it is a rugby Scrum type approach to work, is that you start to learn each other's skills within the team, and so that when the person with the specialist knowledge is away, hopefully the team can carry on.
And I think this is where kind of the bottom line for the answer to Gareth's question is that the role that teamwork plays in flow is that it helps keep the flow going.
That's right.
In the ways that we've just talked about. Cross-functionality. So.
And the team that I'm working with at the moment are trying to reduce the story size so that they can share the work around. Or they're trying to split the stories so they can share the work around the team. It reduces volatility. Is that the volatility? And increases productivity. And ultimately, it reduces volatility because you don't have one person working on a story forever, and that person suddenly disappearing, or you know, something worse happening, or something like
burning
that.
out.
Or you know. Or burning out, exactly.
Hey, we're running low on time. I just wondered, do we want to talk very briefly about that flow diagram and give that show that URL?
Joe could put that. There it is.
So this is the a URL to the flow diagram we were talking about earlier, which is helps you split stories down. So it's a really useful technique, and it's the same techniques that are mentioned in the Scaled Agile framework. So this is the first step. There's 3 steps to this flow diagram. This is the first step. This is basically making sure the story you've written is uses the invest model and is between 1/10 and 1/6 of your velocity, or smaller. And if it isn't, then you go off to the next part of the diagram, which is we haven't put up on the screen because it's just too much information to take in.
But it is really useful. It'd be really great for teams to become familiar with that when they're having these kind of problems.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you could remember what was on that diagram, because I could not read that.
That's right.
I was trying, but it was really hard. Okay, I think that's about all we have for today.
Do we have any other questions?
We do have one more question from Julian. Reduces variability and increases throughput. I think that's more of a comment.
No, that's right. He's correcting my. I said reduces volatility.
I did wonder what you meant by volatility, but I wasn't going to call you.
I knew it was a V word, Julian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks for watching again. Thanks for everyone for watching the couple that we had today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks very much. See you guys.